In the spring of 1945, beneath the cold gray waters of the Kattegat, a German submarine slipped beneath the surface for the last time. She carried 63 men and something else, something loaded in the final chaotic hours before departure, never meant to be found. For 8 decades she rested undisturbed on the seabed. Then, in 2018, a Danish research vessel picked up a strange anomaly on its sonar. She lies at 60 meters in near total darkness, tilted slightly to port on a sandy bottom. To the untrained eye, she might be a natural formation, a ridge, a shadow. But sonar imaging does not lie. The outline is unmistakable. 77 meters of steel, the conning tower still upright, the pressure hull intact. Inside that hull, sealed by seawater and time, something had waited for 80 years. She was a Type 21 U-boat, the most advanced submarine Germany ever built, decades ahead of its time. Twin electric motors capable of 17 knots submerged, a revolutionary snorkel system, allowing battery recharge without surfacing. Naval analysts would say afterward that, had these boats entered service in 1943, the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic might have been different. The Allies feared them. They were right to. The men who served aboard her were young. Their commander was 28 years old. His crew averaged 22. They had trained for months in the Baltic, drilling submerged attacks and emergency procedures. Most had never seen combat. They had joined the Kriegsmarine believing in something. Their country, perhaps, or simply because there was no other choice. Now they stood on a Hamburg deck watching their submarine take on its final cargo. It was April 1945. The Reich was collapsing. Allied armies had crossed the Rhine. Soviet forces were already in the suburbs of Berlin. In this chaos, high-ranking SS officers arrived at the Hamburg docks carrying sealed metal containers. What was loaded into the aft compartments of this submarine that night was never officially declared. What is documented is that the manifest was falsified, and the captain received his orders not from Naval Command, but from the SS. She departed Hamburg on the 2nd of May, 1945. 4 days earlier, Adolf Hitler had shot himself in a Berlin bunker. The war was, to all intents and purposes, over. But this submarine was already running north through the Kattegat, toward the open North Sea, and, it is believed, South America. She never arrived. A British maritime patrol aircraft spotted her at periscope depth. The attack was brief and absolutely decisive. She went down in minutes. 63 men went down with her. There were no survivors. In the British naval record, the sinking was noted in 3 sparse lines. No names. For the families left behind in Hamburg, in Bavaria, in small towns across a shattered Germany, there was only silence. A notification that their son, their husband, their brother was missing at sea. No grave, no body, no answers. Just the sea, indifferent and immense, and a war that had already moved on. For 8 decades the sea kept its secret. The wreck sat in 60 meters, slowly consumed by time. Barnacles encrusted the torpedo tube doors. Sediment crept into the ventilation housings. But inside the pressure hull, in darkness where no light had entered since 1945, the cold seawater did something remarkable. It preserved. Metal containers remained sealed. Documents packed in waterproof casings on that Hamburg night waited perfectly undisturbed in the black and the cold. The children of the missing grew old, and some never stopped searching. One man spent 30 years writing to naval archives in Germany, Britain, and the United States. He traced the attack records, identified the probable sinking coordinates, constructed a meticulous case file. He died in 2001, 17 years before the wreck was found, never knowing how close he had come. His daughter carried on the search. She was the person who first contacted the Danish research team. The Sea War Museum in Tiburon deployed the research vessel Vina in the summer of 2018. Armed with multi-beam echo sounder technology capable of extraordinary seabed resolution, the team began mapping 12 square kilometers of Kattegat floor. The search area was calculated from the original RAF attack coordinates and decades of refined drift modeling. The team were methodical and experienced. They were also prepared for the very real possibility of finding nothing at all. On the 3rd day, the sonar return changed. A shadow appeared on the screen. A long rectangular mass against the smooth sandy bottom. The team gathered around the display. The measurements were unmistakable, 76 meters in length, beam consistent with the Type 21. the distinct raised profile of the conning tower still standing. Someone said it quietly. Then the word spread through the ship. They had found her. After 80 years, they had found her. The first diver to reach the wreck descended on a line in near zero visibility. At 58 meters, the darkness resolved into form. The conning tower emerged from the murk first, massive, encrusted, and strangely whole. He moved along the hull, noting the torpedo tube doors still closed, the deck guns still in position. The U-boat had gone down fast. There had been no time for any of her crew to reach a hatch. None at all. Over multiple dives, the exterior was documented in detail. Every hatch was sealed, each one. On most U-boat wrecks, hatches are found partially open, evidence of desperate last-second escape attempts. Here, there was none. The attack had been instantaneous and catastrophic. The submarine flooded and sank before a single man could reach an exit. 63 men had died precisely where they stood, at their stations, doing their jobs, trusting in steel that could not save them. Using a remotely operated vehicle small enough to navigate through a damaged hull section, the team penetrated the aft storage compartment in 2021. 5 sealed metal containers lay stacked against the aft bulkhead. Analysis conducted under German and Polish archival oversight revealed SS personnel files, financial records, and inventories of assets transferred from occupied Poland. What had been loaded onto this submarine in the final hours of the dying Reich was not treasure. It was evidence someone had needed to vanish. The wreck is, under international maritime law, a war grave. Her 63 crew members remain entombed within the pressure hull, and the Danish government has ensured she will not be disturbed further. The recovered documents are now in the custody of the German Federal Archives. What they ultimately reveal about those final days of the Third Reich is still being examined by historians. The sea gave up part of its secret, but not all of it. The ocean keeps its own counsel. The year is 1943, and Germany is losing the war beneath the waves. It is not losing it slowly. It is losing it in catastrophic, accelerating numbers that Grand Admiral Karl Donitz reads each morning in a briefing room outside Paris, his face a mask of careful stillness, over what must have felt like watching a generation disappear into the sea. In May of that year alone, a month the U-boat crews themselves would come to call Schwarzer Mai Black May, 41 German submarines are sunk. 41. The men who sail them are not yet 30 years old. They are mechanics and radio operators and torpedo men from Hamburg and Cologne and Bremen, and they are dying at a rate that no military force can sustain. The weapons that are killing them are not miraculous. They are methodical. Allied destroyers equipped with improved ASDIC sonar, long-range Liberator patrol aircraft carrying air-to-surface radar that can find a snorkeling U-boat's wake at 15 miles in the dark, Hedgehog mortars that throw a spread of contact-fused bombs ahead of a hunting ship rather than behind it, so the quarry cannot hear them coming and has no time to dive. The Battle of the Atlantic has not been won by a single brilliant stroke. It has been won by engineers and logistics officers and intelligence analysts who spent 2 years studying how the old U-boats hunted, and then, one by one, closed every door. The old U-boats. That phrase, you need to sit with it for a moment, because it contains the entire tragedy of what comes next. The Type 7. Sea submarine, the so-called workhorse of the Kriegsmarine, was a superb instrument of war for the world it was designed to fight in, a world of 1939. By 1943, it was a machine being asked to perform tasks its architecture had never intended. It could make 7 knots submerged, 7, before its battery cells drained to the point where the boat became a passive, sinking target. It could remain below the surface for roughly 12 hours at slow speed before carbon dioxide levels forced the crew to surface and breathe, exposing them to everything the Allies had learned to position overhead. Its acoustic profile, the noise it made moving through water, was detectable by a trained ASDIC operator at ranges that gave the hunter more than enough time to maneuver for a kill. The Type 7 was not obsolete. It was worse than obsolete. It was a death sentence wearing the shape of a weapon. In a series of engineering offices in Hamburg and a classified design bureau in Danzig, this fact had been understood since 1942. The men who understood it most clearly were an unlikely pair: Helmuth Walter, a brilliant and obsessive engineer who had spent years developing hydrogen peroxide turbines for submarines that could travel at extraordinary speeds underwater, and Heinrich Scheurer, a naval architect whose approach was less spectacular and more practical, and who ultimately produced something more dangerous than Walter's elegant but temperamental chemistry. What Scheurer's team gave the Kriegsmarine was the Type Vistispen Electro Boot, the electric boat, and in the vocabulary of submarine warfare, that name meant a revolution. You are looking at something no submarine in the world had yet been. Every boat before it, British, American, Japanese, German, was designed on the same fundamental principle established at the dawn of the 20th century. A vessel that traveled primarily on the surface and submerged only to attack or hide. The ocean surface was its natural environment. Diving was an emergency posture, a temporary state. The Type Vistispen inverted this completely. It was designed to live underwater. The surface was the danger, the depths were home. Its battery cells occupied a volume 3 times greater than those of any previous German submarine, arranged in 2 massive banks along the keel. Submerged sprint speed reached 17 knots in burst mode, fast enough to outrun a convoy escort running ahead to deliver depth charges. Sustained underwater cruising at 5 knots could be maintained for 2 to 3 days without surfacing, without snorkeling, without any contact with the atmosphere above. Its schnorkel mast, a retractable air intake and exhaust system derived from a Dutch design captured in 1940, allowed the diesel engines to recharge batteries while the boat ran at periscope depth, never fully surfacing. Radar cross-section reduced to almost nothing. The outer hull was clad in acoustic tiling, rubber-bonded panels that absorbed rather than reflected the sonar pings of hunting warships. Its passive hydrophone array was sensitive enough to detect convoy traffic at ranges where the convoy had no idea anything was listening. The torpedo room alone would have ended the war differently, where a Type 7 crew spent frantic, sweating minutes cranking manual reload equipment to prepare a second salvo. The Type Vistispen's hydraulic torpedo handling system could reload all 6 forward tubes in under 12 minutes. 23 torpedoes. Targets engaged at ranges under 50 meters in near total silence, the boat never once exposing a periscope, building its firing solution entirely through passive acoustics. No light, no eye contact, pure geometry and patience. Naval historians have spent 8 decades arguing about what this boat might have done if it had arrived in service in 1943. The argument is not really an argument. It is a controlled exercise in sustained horror. Every tactical response the Allies had developed, the long-range aircraft, the improved sonar, the convoy escort doctrine, the hunter-killer groups, had been calibrated against a submarine that surfaced regularly and moved slowly when submerged. Against a vessel that stayed down for days, that stalked at convoy speed invisibly, that could accelerate faster than the pursuing destroyer. The entire apparatus of the Atlantic Victory would have needed to be rebuilt from nothing. The shipping lanes to Britain, to North Africa, to the Pacific, the arithmetic of the war itself, would have reopened as hunting grounds. That is what the Third Reich tried to build in its final year. Not one vessel, an entire fleet. 318 ordered. Production targets of 4 completed submarines per week. The most ambitious naval construction program in history, launched 18 months too late, in cities already on fire. The hull number was U-3523. She was laid down at the Deutsche Werft shipyard complex in Hamburg-Finkenwerder in the late summer of 1944, her prefabricated pressure hull sections arriving by canal barge from 3 different fabrication sites across northern Germany. The men who welded her keel rings into alignment did so on the night shift, to the sound of anti-aircraft batteries firing at formations they could hear but not see. Some of them were master craftsmen. Some of them were 16 years old. The war did not distinguish between those categories anymore, and neither did the production schedule. At 76.5 meters in length and displacing over 1,600 tons surfaced, she was a larger vessel than the Type 70s that had made the Kriegsmarine's Atlantic reputation. Longer, heavier, built to carry more and endure more and remain hidden far longer than anything that had preceded her. Her double-hull construction, with a free-flooding outer casing enclosing the pressure hull, gave her a profile that was noticeably different from every previous submarine in the German fleet. Observers who saw Finnish Type Vinglewinds at the Hamburg yards in early 1945 described them as having a quality of intentionality that earlier boats lacked, something purposeful and compact and somehow final in their design, like a weapon that had waited a long time to be built and had arrived knowing exactly what it was. Her commanding officer was Oberleutnant zur See Friedrich Rust. He was 26 years old. In the photographs that survive from training exercises at Kiel in the winter of 1944 to 1945, Rust appears exactly as young as that number implies, a lean face beneath the white-crowned Kriegsmarine cap, dark rings under his eyes that the military photographer's flash cannot conceal, a set to his jaw that could be read as determination or exhaustion, or both simultaneously, because in February of 1945, those two states were often identical. He had joined the submarine service in 1941, had served as a watch officer aboard a Type 7 during Atlantic patrols that had left him with a fractured rib from a depth charge straddling, and an intimate familiarity with how quickly things could go wrong in 300 meters of water. He was methodical. He was technically precise. He earned the respect of enlisted men the way that careful officers in desperate circumstances always earn it, by knowing the systems, not presuming to know them. He was not a decorated hero of the Great Atlantic Campaign. He was something the Reich needed more desperately in 1945 than heroes, a competent man who had not yet been killed. The crew he commanded numbered 63 men. Their average age was 22. Say their names into what comes next. Obermaschinenmat Karl Drexler, 20 years old, from Dortmund, who had completed his engineering qualification 3 months before reporting to the boat. Funkmat Werner Schlick, 24, from Leipzig, who wrote letters home in small, careful handwriting that his mother would preserve in a lacquered box for 4 decades after the war ended. Bootsmat Heinrich Voss, 21, who had been engaged since Christmas to a girl named Elspeth and had not seen her since February because the accelerated training schedule at Kiel did not permit leave for men of his rank who were needed aboard a boat whose systems were still being debugged. 63 young men from cities that were burning, from families whose letters grew shorter and more frightened as the winter wore on, from a world that everyone aboard U-3523 understood, though no one said, was ending. Type Weinsmeet crew training in 1945 was a process of controlled improvisation. The pipeline that had once taken 2 years, submarine school, specialist qualification, operational training aboard working boats, acceptance trials aboard the new vessel, was being compressed into weeks. The hydrophone operators, on whom the entire combat effectiveness of the Electroboot ultimately depended, were practicing on shore-based simulators that could not replicate the acoustic complexity of the open sea. The torpedo crews ran loading drills until their hands moved without instruction, but there were aspects of the Type 20's behavior. The way its enormous battery mass altered trim under rapid dive conditions, the precise control inputs required to prevent the boat from pitching dangerously during high-speed underwater maneuvers that could only be absorbed through actual experience, in actual water, at actual depth. U-3523 was commissioned on the 6th of February 1945. The Soviet Army was 80 kilometers from Berlin. The RAF had bombed Dresden 4 days earlier. Germany had perhaps 3 months left. What happened in those 3 months unfolded around the crew of U-3523 like weather, present everywhere, impossible to escape, acknowledged only obliquely in the spaces between technical conversations about battery performance and ballast trim. They conducted sea trials in the Baltic, while Königsberg was encircled to the east. They fired practice torpedoes within sight of smoke columns rising from the Rostock waterfront. They listened to the Deutschlandfunk broadcasts in silence and returned to their duty stations, because the duty was what remained when everything else began to dissolve. U-3523 was declared combat-ready in late April 1945. She was one of fewer than 5 Type 20 submarines in the entire Kriegsmarine that could make that claim. She was, by any technical measure, the most dangerous submarine afloat, and her commander had received orders that had nothing to do with combat. In the final days of April, men arrived at the Hamburg docks who did not wear Kriegsmarine uniforms. They came in the night with vehicles that backed directly to the pier, and they oversaw the loading of sealed metal containers whose documentation when documentation was produced at all, listed contents that the dock workers who handled them later described as implausible given their weight. The loading was conducted with an urgency and a secrecy that struck even hardened wartime dockyard men as unusual. When it was finished, the men who had overseen it left without speaking to anyone they didn't have to. And Oberleutnant Roost received his final operational orders. Not south into the Channel, not west into the Atlantic where a Type 29 might at last have shown what it was designed to do, but north, through the Kattegat, into the darkening waters of a sea already littered with the floating wreckage of a civilization coming apart at its seams. What was in those containers has been the question at the center of this story for 80 years. The answer, recovered from the seabed in pieces, is not simple, it is not clean, and it is not finished. Hamburg, April 27, 1945. You can smell it before you see it. The harbor air carries something beyond the usual brine and diesel. It is the smell of burning. Somewhere to the east, in the shattered quarters of a city that had once ranked among Europe's greatest ports, the fires have been burning for days. The RAF's bombers have done their work methodically, and Hamburg is paying the price in rubble and ash. But here, at the Blohm & Voss shipyard, there is still order of a kind, still purpose, still men moving with the deliberate urgency of people who believe, or need to believe, that what they are doing matters. You are watching from the quayside, and what you see does not quite fit the picture of defeat. A convoy of unmarked military lorries has arrived in the pre-dawn darkness. 3 vehicles, their cargo concealed beneath heavy tarpaulins strapped down with steel chain. The drivers do not speak to the dock workers. The dock workers have learned, in the past few weeks, not to ask questions. In the dying Reich, curiosity is a dangerous luxury. The officer who steps out of the lead vehicle is not Kriegsmarine. His collar bears the twin lightning runes of the SS, and his rank insignia marks him as a man of consequence, a man accustomed to having his orders followed without discussion. He produces papers. The dock superintendent examines them. He hands them back without a word. Whatever those papers say, they are enough. Then the unloading begins. What comes off those lorries are 5 metal containers. They are not especially large, each one approximately the size of a steamer trunk, constructed from heavy-gauge steel, sealed with welded flanges and secured with padlocked hasp fittings. They are clearly not standard military freight. They carry no stenciled identification numbers, no unit markings, no destination codes. One of the dock hands, a man named Werner Schudemeyer, who would record his memories in a letter written to his son in 1971, described them as something you might seal a body in. Except they were too heavy for bodies. He estimated that each container weighed between 80 and 100 kilograms. The crane operator swings them down into the forward-loading hatch one by one. The process takes less than 2 hours. When the last container disappears below the pressure hull of the submarine moored at berth 19th, a vessel whose official pennant number is still, at this moment, sealed in the confidential records of a regime preparing to cease to exist, the SS officer retrieves his papers, returns to his lorry, and drives away into the burning morning. By sunrise, it is as though the convoy was never there. What you are looking at in this gray Hamburg dawn is the machinery of concealment operating at full efficiency even as the world above collapses. Germany in the final week of April 1945 is a nation in terminal crisis. Soviet forces are less than 200 kilometers to the east, closing on Berlin in a vice of steel and vengeance. American and British armies have crossed the Rhine and are advancing through a country that no longer has the will or the means to stop them. Adolf Hitler, in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, has retreated into a final delirium of denial and recrimination. The war is over. Every rational mind in Germany knows it. The only question that remains is what comes after. And that question is precisely what makes those 5 containers so important. The Kriegsmarine's official cargo manifest for the submarine at berth 19. The document that would be filed with the Naval Administration Office, copied and archived and, decades later, partially recovered from the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg, lists no special freight. According to the paperwork, the vessel is departing Hamburg in ballast, provisioned for a combat patrol in the North Sea. The manifest itemizes fuel, torpedoes, food supplies, spare parts. It does not mention 5 sealed steel containers loaded in the pre-dawn hours by men who wore no naval uniforms. This is a document that lies. Archivists working with the German Naval Records Center in the 1990s noted specific anomalies in the filing sequence, entries that appeared to have been backdated, weight figures that did not match the vessel's known displacement calculations when loaded to combat trim. Dr. Heinz Meyer, a naval historian at the University of Hamburg who examined the original paperwork in 2003, described the manifest as clearly amended. The official loading record, he wrote, appeared to have been revised after the fact by someone who had access to both the original and the administrative stamp. In other words, someone knew the containers existed, and someone took deliberate steps to make the paper record say otherwise. Why? That is the question that will drive everything that follows. That is the question that haunted the families of 63 men who would never come home, the researchers who spent decades sifting through fragments of incomplete records, and the divers who finally, 80 years later, descended through black water to the seabed where this submarine lies. Why, in the final days of a collapsing empire, did someone consider the contents of 5 sealed containers important enough to falsify a military record, to deploy SS personnel to a naval facility, to load them in darkness and in secrecy onto one of the most capable submarines Germany ever built? The answer, it turns out, required 80 years and a camera mounted on a remotely operated vehicle to begin to find. The SS had been preparing for this moment for months, long before the final collapse became inevitable, before the bridges over the Rhine were blown, before the Reich Chancellery lay in rubble, before the Führer married his mistress in a concrete room 40 meters below a burning city. Certain men within Himmler's apparatus had begun to think about survival, not Germany's survival, their own, and the survival of something they considered more valuable than any individual life: the documentation, the evidence, the proof of what had been built. You have to understand what that means. The Third Reich was, among other things, a bureaucratic state of terrifying thoroughness. It generated paperwork the way a factory generates product, ceaselessly, systematically, in staggering volume. Every order was written down, every transport was logged, every transaction was recorded. The apparatus of the SS maintained files, in triplicate, in multiple locations, in dedicated archival facilities, that documented operations the perpetrators knew would be viewed, in any conceivable post-war world, as crimes of the highest magnitude. Most of those records, in the final months and weeks, were destroyed. The orders went out from Berlin in early 1945, burn the files, shred the documents, reduce the paper trail to ash. Across occupied Europe, in camp offices and Gestapo headquarters and administrative centers, SS personnel fed years of paperwork into furnaces. The destruction was systematic, extensive, but it was not complete. It was not complete because some men understood that the documents they held were not merely evidence of crimes. They were leverage. They were currency. In the post-war world that was coming, a world in which former SS officers would need new identities, new countries, new protections, the right documents, or the right knowledge of where documents were buried, might be worth more than gold, worth more even than whatever you could load onto a submarine and sail to a neutral country. What the 5 containers aboard the submarine at Berth 19 actually held has been a matter of historical speculation for 8 decades. The archival analysis conducted between 2021 and 2023, following the ROV penetration of the wreck's aft storage compartment, has provided partial but significant answers. But before we reach that moment of revelation, before we descend with the cameras into the cold dark where those containers still sit, it is worth tracing what the historical record, fragmentary and contested as it is, suggests about their contents and their purpose. The SS officer who supervised the loading at Blohm and Voss has been tentatively identified through cross-referencing of wartime personnel records as a figure connected to the economic administrative main office of the SS, the WVHA, the bureaucratic heart of the concentration camp system. This identification, first proposed by researcher Claudia Brandt in her 2009 monograph on SS financial operations, is not definitive. The wartime records are incomplete, the documentary chain broken in several places. But The connection, if real, would explain a great deal about why the containers were sealed and why their manifest was falsified. The WVHA was, in the most clinical possible terms, the organization that managed the economic exploitation of slave labor and the liquidation of the assets of those murdered in the camps. Its records documented transactions that no post-war legal tribunal could be allowed to examine in full, and its senior figures, as 1945 drew to its close, were in desperate motion, trying to move both themselves and their paper trails beyond the reach of Allied justice. The submarine was not, on this reading, a combat vessel. It was a courier, a very fast, very capable, very hard-to-catch courier, carrying sealed freight from Hamburg to a destination that the falsified manifest deliberately obscured. The question of where it was going matters less in the end than the question of why it never arrived. The young men who crewed that vessel almost certainly did not know what they were carrying. The testimonies of sailors who served on similar late-war U-boat missions, gathered by naval historians at the Deutsche Marine Institute across several decades, consistently describe crews who were told nothing beyond their basic operational orders: departure time, heading, radio silence protocols. The need-to-know principle was absolute. A torpedo man from Kiel did not need to know why his boat was carrying sealed containers in the aft storage space. He needed to know his battle station, his watch rotation. He needed to know how to do his job. And in the early hours of May 2nd, 1945, as the lines were cast off and the submarine's diesels settled into their deep, rhythmic thunder, and the lights of a burning Hamburg fell away behind the conning tower, 63 men were simply trying to do theirs. Most of them were in their 20s, some were younger. They had families in Kiel and Bremen and Hamburg itself, mothers who would wait for letters that never came, fathers who would spend the post-war years making quiet inquiries at naval offices and receiving, in return, the same hollow phrase: missing, presumed, lost. They had no part in whatever was sealed in those 5 containers. They knew only that their orders had come through channels they were not permitted to question, that their commander had cleared the harbor on schedule, and that somewhere ahead of them, beyond the shallow Danish straits and the cold reaches of the Kattegat, lay whatever the war had left of their futures. They had 3 days. The sea between Hamburg and the open Atlantic is not long, but it passes through waters that, in the first days of May 1945, were no longer German waters in any meaningful sense. They were watched waters, patrolled waters, waters where RAF Coastal Command had spent 5 years learning to find and kill submarines, and where the final collapse of German air cover meant that a U-boat running surfaced, as she would need to do in those shallow northern reaches to make any kind of speed, was a target without protection. The submarine sailed into that killing ground, carrying her secret and her crew. She carried them north, through the gray chop of the Kattegat, toward a horizon that offered no refuge. When the RAF patrol aircraft spotted her on the morning of May 4th, she had been running for less than 48 hours. She was still in shallow water. She was still, in every meaningful sense, within reach. She had nowhere to hide. The morning of May 2nd, 1945, broke cold and gray over the Elbe estuary, the kind of morning that smells of salt and coal smoke and something harder to name, the smell of a world coming apart. Hamburg lay behind them now, its skyline reduced to skeletal chimney stacks and the dull orange smudge of fires that had been burning for 3 days. The Type 21 boat slid from the harbor mouth under electric motors only, running silent in the manner she had been designed to do, her wake barely a ripple against the pewter surface of the water. No ceremony attended her departure, no brass band, no waving crowds. The men on the bridge stood with their collars turned up and their eyes cast forward, and the city that had built them receded like a bad dream. She had 48 hours to reach the Kattegat before the fuel calculations became unforgiving. The strait between Denmark and Sweden was barely 90 kilometers wide at its narrowest, a corridor of gray-green water that in the final months of the war had become one of the most heavily patrolled stretches of ocean on Earth. RAF Coastal Command had stationed Liberators and Sunderlands and Mosquitoes at airfields across eastern England and liberated Denmark, and their crews flew round-the-clock anti-submarine sweeps with the methodical patience of men who knew that the war was nearly over and did not intend to die in its closing hours by letting their guard slip. The U-boat's captain knew this. He had read the intelligence summaries before departing, had noted the loss of 5 boats in the previous 2 weeks, in the very waters he was now entering. He chose to run as deep as his orders would allow, relying on the Type 21's extraordinary battery capacity to keep him submerged for stretches that would have been impossible for any submarine built before her. The boat moved north through the night of May 2nd, navigating by dead reckoning through the Fehmarn Belt, the channel between the German island of Fehmarn and the Danish coast. The captain had chosen a route that would take them close to the Swedish territorial limit, where RAF patrols were somewhat less frequent and where the shallow bathymetry might complicate airborne radar returns. It was a calculated risk, one of dozens he had made since accepting command. He had been at sea in U-boats since 1942, had survived the Atlantic, survived the Bay of Biscay, survived the kind of depth charging that turned men's bowels to water and cracked welds. He understood risk at a molecular level. What he could not calculate was what lay sealed in the aft compartment, and who would be waiting when he arrived, and whether those 2 questions had the same answer. Below decks, the crew moved through their routines, with the mechanical efficiency of men who had trained for this and nothing else. The boat smelled the way all submarines smelled, diesel fuel baked into the bulkheads, human sweat absorbed into every surface, the faint metallic breath of recycled air pushed through scrubbers. They were 63 men in a steel tube running north through the dark, and most of them were very young. The engineering officer was 26. The youngest torpedo mate was 18 years old, a boy from Rostock, who had enlisted in the autumn of 1944, believing, as young men will, that the war might still be won. None of them spoke much about where they were going or what they carried. The sealed compartment aft had been explained to them in terms that explained nothing. Classified materiel, not their concern. They did their jobs. On May 3rd, the boat raised periscope depth once, briefly, to take a navigational fix. The officer of the watch noted the bearing, noted the cloud cover, broken with gaps, and ordered the boat back down within 90 seconds. The precaution was correct. At approximately 1100 hours, a consolidated Liberator of numbered 86 Squadron, flying its standard search pattern at 8,000 feet, passed within 12 kilometers of the U-boat's position. The aircraft's radar operator logged a possible contact, uncertain, the signature too brief, and the return too weak to classify with confidence. He marked it in his notebook with a question mark and moved on. That question mark would haunt him for the rest of his life, once he understood what it represented. The following morning, May 4th, 1945, the weather had changed. A high-pressure system had pushed the cloud cover north overnight, and by dawn, the Kattegat lay under a pale, crystalline sky, the kind of visibility that a navigator dreams of and a submarine commander fears. The U-boat was running at 18 meters, shallower than prudence dictated, because the captain needed to take a star fix and there had been no clean horizon for 36 hours. He chose a window of 20 minutes, raised the periscope, took his reading, and was in the process of ordering the dive resumed when the hydrophone operator heard it, the distant descending pitch of aircraft engines at very low altitude. The report reached the bridge in 4 words. Aircraft. Close. Bearing northeast. The alarm was sounded. The order was given. The boat began to dive. And for 17 seconds, everything that 63 human beings had ever been, or would ever be, depended entirely on the depth gauge and the rate of descent. 17 seconds was not enough. The de Havilland Mosquito of No. 143 Squadron had been flying its patrol for 4 hours and 40 minutes when its crew spotted the white feather of a periscope wake at 0743 local time. The pilot, a 24-year-old flight lieutenant from Yorkshire, banked hard and came in on the attack at deck height. 2 rockets left the aircraft's rails in rapid succession. The first struck the water 10 meters short of the conning tower and detonated on impact with the hull just below the waterline. The second entered through the pressure hull at almost the same instant. There was no explosion in the Hollywood sense, no column of fire. There was a concussive shock wave that rolled across the surface of the Kattegat in an expanding ring, a brief convulsion of white water, and then the sea closed over the place where the U-boat had been, as if she had never existed at all. The Mosquito circled once. The crew noted the position, took their photographs, and logged the time. In the air crew's report, filed that evening at their base in Banff, Scotland, the action was recorded in 23 words. It was, by the accounting of that terrible spring, a routine kill. The crew would be mentioned in dispatches. They would go home to Yorkshire and Aberdeenshire and talk very little about any of it for the rest of their lives. No one in the water survived. The depth at the point of sinking was listed in RAF records as approximately 90 meters, though the actual figure, as the sonar surveys conducted 6 decades later would reveal, was closer to 83. It made no difference. At that depth, with the pressure hull breached and the boat's angle of descent already past the point of recovery, there was no time for escape, no working of the Draeger apparatus, no rational sequence of survival decisions. The 63 men aboard died in the same moment, in the dark, in the cold, in a place where no one was watching except the pilot of a British aircraft banking northward into the morning sky. That evening, at a schoolhouse on Lüneburg Heath, Field Marshal Montgomery accepted the formal surrender of all German forces in northwest Europe, Denmark, the Netherlands, the North Sea Islands, the warships at sea. The guns in the north fell silent before midnight. For the crew of the U-boat, the ceasefire came 11 hours too late. The sea kept them. It keeps them still. News of the sinking reached the families slowly and unevenly through the wreckage of a communications infrastructure that had ceased to function. In the chaos of those final days, cities burning, roads choked with refugees, the administrative machinery of the Third Reich disintegrating column by column, the mechanisms by which the Kriegsmarine notified next of kin had largely ceased to work. Some families received a telegram within a week. Others waited months. A mother in Bremen learned of her son's death in the autumn of 1945, after the war had been over for nearly 5 months, from a neighbor who had heard it, from someone who had served in the same flotilla. A wife in Kiel spent 3 years after the armistice writing letters to naval offices that no longer existed, receiving in return form letters that addressed her husband in the past tense without quite stating what that meant. The machinery of grief, like the machinery of war, broke down unevenly and without mercy. For the families of the men aboard that particular U-boat, there was an additional layer of silence. The mission had been classified to a degree unusual even by the standards of the final days of the Reich. The boat's departure from Hamburg had not been logged through normal channels. Her sailing orders, if they had ever existed as formal documents, had been destroyed, possibly deliberately, in the days immediately following the German capitulation. When families contacted the Naval Records Office in Flensburg in 1946, they were told that information pertaining to their relatives' last assignment was unavailable. The word used in that careful bureaucratic German of the post-war period was nicht auffindbar, not retrievable, not found. The families heard in that word what they had feared for years, not just loss, but erasure, and yet the world moved on in the way that worlds do. Germany was rebuilt. The men who had survived the war found work, found wives, had children, did not speak of certain things at the dinner table. The generation that had fought and lost contracted into itself, carrying its knowledge like ballast, like the weight of something sealed below the waterline. The Kattegat continued to be the Kattegat, a commercial shipping lane, a fishing ground, a body of water that neither remembered nor forgot. In the early 1950s, a retired Danish fisherman named Anker Christensen told his son that he had seen something strange on the morning of May 4th, 1945. He had been mending nets near the Lezu Trendle Shoal when he heard the sound of aircraft, low and fast, and had watched from his boat as 2 plumes of water rose from the surface of the sea, approximately 4 kilometers to his northwest. Then silence. Then nothing. He had not known what he was seeing. He had not mentioned it during the war because mentioning things during the German occupation of Denmark was sometimes fatal. He mentioned it to his son in 1951 in the matter-of-fact way that men of his generation and region described things they had witnessed, without drama, without conclusion. His son wrote it down in a letter to the Danish Naval History Archive. The letter was filed. For 40 years, no one read it. This was, in miniature, the story of the wreck itself in the post-war decades. A fact that existed in fragments, scattered across different archives, different languages, different national administrative systems that had no particular reason to communicate with one another. A reference in an RAF sortie log at the National Archives in Kew. A pension claim filed by a widow in Hamburg in 1948 that listed the boat's hull number without context. a sonar anomaly noted by a Danish hydrographic survey vessel in 1987 and attributed, without further investigation, to geological formation. The pieces were all there. They lay in their respective darkness, waiting for someone to look for them in the right sequence. That someone would not come for decades. The world had other catastrophes to attend to, other reckonings with the catastrophe that the Second World War had been. The men on the seabed aged only in the imaginations of the people who had loved them, who themselves aged and eventually died, taking their memories with them. By the end of the 20th century, most of the families with direct connections to the crew had lost the thread entirely. They knew there had been a grandfather, a great-uncle, a figure at the edge of family photographs whose name was not spoken. They knew the war had taken him. They did not know where. Then, in 2018, a researcher at the Seawar Museum, Jutland in Thyborøn, pulled a digitized RAF sortie log from a database, cross-referenced a grid coordinate with a Danish hydrographic chart, and found that the sonar anomaly recorded in 1987 lay precisely where a Mosquito crew had reported a kill 73 years before. She entered the coordinates into a mapping program and studied the bathymetric data on her screen. The shape of the seabed was wrong in the way that a geological formation would not explain. The shape of the seabed was the shape of something that had been built by human hands and put there by human violence. She closed the file, opened a new one, and began writing the proposal that would eventually become the 2021 survey expedition. The question that had been sitting unanswered on the floor of the Kattegat for 8 decades was about to be asked again, this time by people with the tools to hear the answer. The silence that follows catastrophe carries its own particular weight. For 63 families scattered across Germany, Austria, and the shattered remnants of a defeated nation, the summer of 1945 offered not grief, but suspension. A state worse than mourning, because it permitted hope. You understand? Standing at the edge of that uncertainty, how a family can wait for years without resolution. How a mother in a bombed-out apartment in Hamburg might keep a photograph on the mantelpiece long after the others had been put away. The Kriegsmarine had ceased to exist as an institution. The men who might have filed the reports, who might have known where the boat had gone and why, had either died themselves, been taken prisoner, or dispersed into the fog of post-war Europe. The records that survived were incomplete, deliberately falsified in some cases, or simply destroyed in the Allied bombing of naval headquarters at Kiel and Flensburg. There were no witnesses. No distress signal had been recorded on the night of May 4th. No wreckage washed ashore on the Danish coast. For the families of the 63 men aboard, there was only the waiting and then the official letters. Correspondence written with the bureaucratic coldness of a state that no longer existed. Notifications of presumed death. The phrase missing in action, repeated in different formulations, each one a door closed rather than opened. A widow in Bremen received a letter from the newly constituted West German Naval Archive in 1953, informing her that her husband's vessel had departed Hamburg on the night of the 2nd of May, 1945, and had not returned to port. 8 years after the fact, 2 sentences. You see those letters now, reproduced in research files. The ink faded to brown, the paper brittle at the folds, and you feel the weight of institutional inadequacy pressing down across the decades. Some families accepted the finality and rebuilt their lives around the absence. Others could not. Among the latter was a retired schoolteacher from Lübeck named Heinrich Schaefer, whose younger brother Klaus had served as the boat's forward torpedo mechanic. Klaus had been 23 years old when the vessel departed Hamburg. He would have been 23 when it sank. Heinrich began writing letters in 1958. He wrote to the Bundesarchiv Militär Archive in Freiburg. He wrote to the Danish Maritime Authority and to the British Admiralty's historical branch in London. He wrote, in careful formal English, to the United States National Archives in Washington. He received, in return, fragments. A Royal Air Force Coastal Command operations log, noting a sighting and attack in the northern Kattegat on the evening of May 4th, 1945. A British Admiralty summary confirming the participation of 2 Liberator aircraft of 311 Squadron. The coordinates were approximate. Maritime positions in wartime were always approximate, but they pointed to a zone of cold water roughly 20 kilometers northwest of the island of Anholt. Heinrich Schaefer did not have access to sonar equipment or a research vessel. What he had was persistence and a meticulous mind trained on 30 years of correcting students' essays. He assembled his correspondence into a bound volume, cross-referenced and annotated in pencil, and deposited a copy with the German War Graves Commission in 1967. He died in 1971 without ever knowing what lay at the bottom of the Kattegat. But his research did not die with him. It passed by a circuitous archival path to a Danish amateur maritime historian named Jørgen Vilhelmsen, who encountered it in the Kriegsmarine records held by the Danish National Archives in the 1980s. Vilhelmsen was already known in Danish maritime circles for his patient documentation of Allied and German shipping losses in coastal waters during the occupation years. He recognized the significance of what Schaefer had assembled. He also recognized its incompleteness. There were too many gaps, too many places where the surviving official records simply went silent. By the early 1990s, Vilhelmsen had expanded the documentary foundation considerably. He located a second RAF report, previously overlooked in the Public Record Office at Kew, which contained the full aircrew debriefing from the attacking aircraft. The pilot, a Czech airman flying under RAF command, had described watching the submarine begin to dive, not an emergency crash dive, but a controlled descent, which the debriefing officer had noted as unusual given the severity of the bomb hits observed. The detail was troubling. A vessel struck amidships by 250-pound depth charges did not make a controlled descent unless its crew were already dead or incapacitated before she went under. Vilhelmsen filed the anomaly in his notes with a question mark beside it. It would take another decade and the collapse of a political order for its full significance to emerge. When the Soviet Union fell, the archives of the former German Democratic Republic became accessible to Western researchers, and they contained something no Western archive held: a typed requisition order dated April 28, 1945, stamped with the letterhead of the Reich Main Security Office, authorizing the loading of sealed containers aboard a named vessel at the Blohm and Voss facility in Hamburg. The cargo designation was a bureaucratic cipher, one of dozens the SS used to obscure the nature of materials in transit during the final weeks of the Reich. But the date, the port, and the vessel's designation aligned precisely with what Schaefer had spent his retirement pursuing. The question was no longer whether the boat had carried a secret cargo. The question was what that cargo had been, and whether it still lay sealed and intact on the floor of the Kattegat. Vilhelmsen shared his findings at a symposium on Second World War maritime heritage in Copenhagen in 1999. The audience was small: historians, archivists, a handful of journalists who would file brief items and move on. But in the back row sat a research coordinator from the Seawar Museum, Jutland in Tiburon, named Niels Jørgen Christoffersen, who had spent much of his career cataloging the extraordinary density of wartime wrecks in Danish and Jutland coastal waters. He listened without interrupting. He asked no questions during the session. Afterward, in the corridor outside the hall, he stopped Vilhelmsen and asked one question: had anyone ever attempted to physically locate the wreck? Vilhelmsen shook his head. The technology was too expensive for private researchers. The search zone encompassed several square kilometers of open seabed. The water depth ranged from 80 to 120 meters. Without dedicated multi-beam sonar equipment and a purpose-equipped survey vessel, the boat would remain precisely where she had always been: unknown, unreachable, lost. Christoffersen asked Vilhelmsen to write down the coordinates. There was no notebook to hand, and so the numbers were written on the back of a conference program, a folded paper printed with that morning's panel schedule. Christoffersen put it in his jacket pocket, carried it back to Cyborun, and placed it in the top drawer of his office desk, where it would remain for 7 years. The catalyst arrived in the form of a technology rather than a person. By the mid-2000s, multi-beam sonar, the instrument family that had mapped the Titanic's debris field and located the Bismarck on the floor of the Atlantic, had become accessible to institutions smaller than national navies. Research vessels equipped with hull-mounted transducer arrays could now sweep wide corridors of seabed in a single pass, assembling the acoustic return data into three-dimensional images of extraordinary resolution. Features as small as a periscope housing were legible: propeller shafts, conning tower silhouettes. The seabed gave up its secrets, one measured sweep at a time, to anyone with the patience and the funding to look. Christopherson had watched this technology transform maritime archaeology throughout the 1990s. When the Seawar Museum secured a research partnership with the Danish Agency for Culture and Palaces in 2006, and with it access to a dedicated survey vessel for an annual summer expedition, he opened the desk drawer and unfolded the conference program. The ink on the back had faded slightly. The coordinates were still legible. The first survey pass took place in August 2007. The vessel swept a 6-kilometer corridor across the most probable search zone, the multi-beam transducers painting the Kattegat floor in swaths of rendered color on the operator's monitor. The depth varied between 90 and 114 meters, cold, dark, and largely featureless. The sediment flat and undisturbed except for the occasional anchor drag scar from the shipping lanes that had operated silently overhead for 60 years. They found no anomaly in the first pass, nothing in the second. A second expedition followed in 2009, delayed a year by budget constraints. This time, the survey corridor shifted northwest, incorporating a zone that Wilhelmsen had identified using a corrected grid reference. The 1945 RAF coordinates had been recorded using an outdated maritime notation system, and a modest recalculation placed the probable sinking position 3 kilometers from the original estimate. 3 kilometers is a short distance on land. On the open floor of the Kattegat, it is a long way to be wrong. Nothing in 2009, nothing in 2011. The project accumulated years without result, and there were voices within the institution suggesting that the resources might be better directed toward known wrecks with undocumented conditions, vessels whose positions were not in question, whose histories were already confirmed. Christopherson acknowledged the argument. He did not act on it. The breakthrough came not from another summer expedition, but from a technical report published by the Danish Maritime Authority in 2017. A routine hydrographic survey of the central Kattegat, conducted solely for the purposes of updating navigational charts, had covered an area that overlapped by roughly 30% with the northeastern edge of Christopherson's search zone. The data was public. When he obtained the raw files and ran them through the museum's processing software, he saw it immediately. On the screen, at a depth of 107 meters, in a position approximately 16 kilometers northwest of Anholt, there was an elongated shadow, 76 meters in length. Sitting at a slight list to starboard, the stern buried in silt, the bow lifted as if making a final gesture toward a surface it had not reached in 7 decades. The profile was unmistakable to anyone who had spent years studying the silhouettes of Second World War submarine designs. He called Wilhelmsen, who was by then in his 80s, and described what was on the screen. There was a long silence on the telephone before the old historian spoke. The Seawar Museum mounted a formal survey expedition in the summer of 2018. The research vessel departed Thyborøn on a clear morning in June, her deck carrying a remotely operated vehicle, 2 marine archaeologists, a sonar specialist, and Christopherson himself. The crossing to the site took 4 hours. When the vessel reached the coordinates, the Kattegat lay still, the sky a pale Scandinavian blue, the water dark and opaque below the surface. Whatever lay beneath had been invisible from above for 73 years. That was, in a sense, the entire point. The ROV entered the water at midday. Its cameras transmitted in real time to a monitor in the operations room where the team gathered in silence. For the first 8 minutes, the image showed only open water, the vehicle descending through diminishing light. At 90 meters, the ambient illumination faded entirely, and the LED arrays took over, casting a cone of white light into absolute darkness. Then, at the outer edge of that cone, something emerged, a curve, a line, metal. The conning tower came first, that distinctive streamlined sail of the type Fundy seats, taller and more angular than the older Atlantic designs, unmistakable in silhouette, even under decades of marine growth. Then the hull, the pressure casing intact along its forward 2/3. The characteristic double-hull profile of the Schnorsel intake visible amidships. Pale incrustations covered everything. Silt had drifted against the starboard side in long, smooth ridges, pressing against the steel with the slow patience of decades. But the boat was there. She was whole. She had been there for 73 years, and she had waited. The identification came through the hull markings. On the conning tower, beneath a layer of biological growth, the ROV's camera captured the outline of painted numerals, degraded but legible after digital enhancement processing. They matched. The vessel lying at 107 meters in the Kattegat was precisely the boat that Heinrich Schaefer had spent his retirement searching for, that Wilhelmsen had tracked through archives from Freiburg to Kew, that Christofferson had carried folded in his jacket pocket since a corridor in Copenhagen 19 years before. The 4-hour dive documented the catastrophic rupture along the midships section, consistent with the bomb hits described in the RAF debriefing, the collapse of the engineering spaces, the sealed crew hatches that had not been opened, not from the inside, not from without. In 7 decades, the wreck lay exactly as it had sunk, undisturbed, unvisited, preserved by the cold and the dark with a fidelity that bordered on the uncanny. And then, in the aft storage compartment at the extreme end of the pressure hull, the cameras recorded something the sonar data alone had not resolved, something that had not come to rest there by accident. 5 sealed metal containers, stacked with evident care against the after bulkhead, their locks intact, their surfaces encrusted but unbreached, still sealed, still waiting. Whatever the SS had loaded at Hamburg in the final days of April 1945 had survived the crossing, survived the attack, survived 8 decades of cold and pressure and silence. It had been waiting a long time to be found. The question that Heinrich Schaefer had carried for the rest of his life, the question that Wilhelmsen had transformed from a family's private grief into historical urgency, the question that had lived in the top drawer of a desk in Thyborøn for 7 years, was no longer where. It was what. The ROV descends on a Thursday morning in October 2021, its thrusters whispering against the cold. 41 meters below the surface of the Kattegat, the light has long since surrendered. You watch the feed on the monitor aboard the research vessel, a square of deep indigo resolving in the sweep of the ROV's LED array into something your mind struggles at first to categorize. A wall, a curved wall of steel, barnacled and brown, trailing the ghosts of decades of marine growth. It is the pressure hull. You have been here before, but today you are going inside. The decision to attempt a penetration of the aft storage compartment had not been made lightly. The wreck lies on her port side at a 40-degree list, and the stern section, where the torpedo loading hatch once sealed the world out, has partially collapsed over 80 years. The marine archaeologists and the German Naval Heritage Committee had spent 3 years debating the risks, structural failure, contamination of evidence, and above all, the disturbance of a war grave. 63 men died in this boat. Their remains, or what the sea has left of them, are still somewhere inside. That fact had never been forgotten, not even for a moment, but the sonar anomaly would not let anyone rest. During the 2018 survey, the multi-beam scans had returned an unexpected density reading from within the aft section. 5 distinct objects, roughly cylindrical, arranged in a pattern inconsistent with standard torpedo equipment or ballast. The Navy's technical analysts had studied the raw data for months. Whatever was stowed in that compartment was not listed on any known patrol manifest. The discrepancy was, as the chief archaeologist later wrote in the salvage report, too regular to be debris and too dense to be organic. Something had been placed there deliberately, something that had not moved in 80 years. The ROV threads through the gap where the loading hatch once sealed the world out. You hold your breath without meaning to. The interior materializes in the camera's light in stages. First the overhead, draped in curtains of marine growth that sway in the wash from the thrusters. Then the deck, tilted, covered in a fine gray silt that rises in slow spiraling clouds as the vehicle disturbs it. Then, almost immediately, the first container. It is approximately the size of a steamer trunk. Its surface is dark gray beneath the oxidation and the long chemistry of salt water, the underlying color still visible in protected seams where the sea is not quite reached. It is not a standard Kriegsmarine container. The construction, as the cameras record in high definition for the first time, is heavier than torpedo equipment would require. Riveted plate, double welded at every corner, with an integrated locking mechanism corroded shut long ago. There are 4 others behind it, nested against the port hull. Together, they occupy the majority of the aft stowage space. Whatever else this U-boat may have been carrying, These containers were the priority. No SS insignia is visible. No markings of any kind survive on the exterior. Either they were never applied, or the sea has erased them over 8 decades. But the construction itself speaks. German naval historians who reviewed the ROV footage in the weeks that followed would note that riveted containers of this specific gauge and design were associated with one purpose in the final months of the war: the secure transport of materials designated for long-term preservation. They were not loaded here for combat. They were loaded for survival. The ROV photographs the containers from every accessible angle. It takes laser measurements. It conducts a passive radiation survey. The scientists on the surface had insisted. Given the rumors that had gathered around this wreck over the years, the survey returns clean. Whatever these containers hold, it is not radioactive material. The lead archaeologist exhales audibly on the audio log of the dive. That particular fear, at least, has been laid to rest. The decision to raise the containers is made by consensus between the Danish Maritime Authority, the German Federal Archives, and a team from the Warsaw Institute for Holocaust Research, whose involvement had been requested following early archival evidence connecting this boat's departure to SS operations out of Hamburg in April 1945. The operation takes 4 months to plan and 6 days to execute. A specialist salvage team, working under the supervision of naval conservators, uses hydraulic lifting bags and a fabricated steel cradle to bring the containers to the surface one at a time, without applying direct mechanical stress to the corroded seams. On a gray November morning in 2021, the first container breaks the surface of the Kattegat for the first time in 76 years. It is sealed immediately in a humidity-controlled transport case. No one touches it with bare hands. No one speaks above a murmur. All 5 containers are brought aboard, intact. The double-welded construction that had seemed excessive when these were built in a Hamburg workshop in the spring of 1945 had done exactly what its designers intended. The sea had pressed against those seams for 8 decades and found them holding. You do not know yet what is inside, but you know that someone, in the dying hours of the Third Reich, had wanted very badly for whatever this was to survive. The containers are opened in a secure facility in Kiel on a Tuesday morning in February 2022, under the joint observation of German archivists, Polish historians, Danish maritime heritage officials, and 2 representatives from the International Criminal Court's Historical Evidence Division. The last detail noted quietly in the session's official record, without further explanation, as if everyone in the room already understood why they were there. You are not in that room. But the footage, recorded under strict protocol, will eventually be released, and you will be able to watch the moment a seal breaks after 77 years of darkness. The first container yields a dense bundle of waterproofed document pouches, each sealed with a wax compound that has partially degraded but has nevertheless preserved the contents in a remarkable state. The archivists open them carefully, one by one, under protective lighting, calibrated to avoid damaging the ink. What emerges is a collection of files spanning approximately 200 pages of typescript and handwritten correspondence. The language is German. The dates cluster around April 12th to April 28th, 1945, the last 16 days before this U-boat departed Hamburg. They are not military orders. They are not patrol logs or operational directives. They are personnel records, financial transfer documents, and coded property inventories. The bureaucratic skeleton of a flight operation, coordinated between at least 3 SS administrative offices, 2 of which had already been dissolved or relocated by April 1945 as the Reich collapsed from within. The financial documents reference accounts in Geneva and Buenos Aires. The property inventories are written in a cipher that took the archivists 6 weeks to reconstruct, using a key found in the third container, a small leather-bound codebook embossed with a double lightning bolt, and the initials of an SS Obersturmbannführer, whose name appears across several of the enclosed files. A mid-level administrator from the Economic and Administrative Main Office, the branch that had managed the Reich's concentration camp network, and the accounting of everything extracted from it. The fourth container holds identification documents for 12 individuals, none of whom appear on the U-boat's official crew manifest. The photographs attached to several of the documents show men in civilian clothing, ranging in apparent age from their mid-30s to their early 60s. Whether any of these individuals were actually aboard when the boat went down, whether any of them are numbered among the 63 dead, became one of the most consequential questions in the subsequent historical investigation. Cross-referencing with Allied occupation records, Nuremberg trial archives, and the files of the International Tracing Service took teams of researchers more than a year. Several of the names were already known, already flagged in wartime intelligence files that had sat in British and American archives since 1945, unconnected until now to any physical evidence. The fifth container is the smallest and the heaviest. It holds a sealed case containing a collection of uncut gemstones, diamonds and rubies, wrapped in cloth, catalogued in a manifest that matches asset seizure records from the Jewish community of Łódź, dated March 1944. The room is very quiet when this is confirmed. It has been almost exactly 80 years. There is a word that surfaces repeatedly in the reports produced in the weeks after the Kiel opening: provenance. The archivists use it with technical precision. Everyone else uses it with weight. Provenance means, where did this come from? It means, who did this belong to before it was taken? It means, what happened to the people it was taken from? The gemstones are currently held by the German government, pending restitution, claims filed by descendants of the Łódź community. The documents have been transferred to the Federal Archives in Berlin. The codebook is in Warsaw. The wreck sits on the floor of the Kattegat, unchanged. The 63 men of her crew remain where they fell, in the cold and the dark, in a seabed now officially recognized as both a protected war grave and an active site of historical evidence. A designation with no precedent in maritime law that required 2 years of international negotiation to formalize. A permanent exclusion zone surrounds the site. There will be no further penetration dives. What remains inside belongs to the dead. But what the dead had to say has now been heard. A U-boat does not become a monument easily. It is a weapon after all, crewed by young men who in many cases had little understanding of what lay sealed in the compartment behind them, and no say in the mission they were assigned. The 63 who died on the 4th of May 1945 were not architects of what the containers held. They were sailors, most of them barely into their 20s, delivered to the bottom of a cold sea without warning or mercy. They deserve to rest in peace. History is under no such obligation. The ocean does not forget. It waits. And when the time finally comes, when the sonar finds the shape in the dark, when the camera descends, when steel sealed in a Hamburg workshop in 1945 opens for the first time, what was hidden does not disappear. It simply becomes true again.